you think about recharging, you usually think of a computer, your cell phone, or the batteries to your favorite electronics. But even living, breathing organisms need to recharge. We just use a different term for the process: sleep. Specialists suggest that somewhere around 8 hours of it is needed, and even more when you're still growing up. This is what we consider normal, as no person can survive without this mandatory rest. Yet this fact is put to the test in this creepypasta, in a story about Soviet scientists testing what happens when you go without slumber, and this is what has become to be known as the Russian sleep experiment. The story begins within a Russian facility where they are experimenting on political prisoners right after World War II. The prisoners are set in a chamber with microphones and a couple portholes to observe them as subjects. The experiment itself consisted of a chamber being sealed and filled with an airborne stimulant that forces the men to stay awake. This would last for 15 days, where they would be taken out of the chamber and examined to see what kind of effects came from the extended sleep deprivation. Over the first 4 days there is no unusual activities, but it is observed that the conversations get more and more dark and depressing as time goes on. Paranoia begins to be exuded by the men as they begin to talk exclusively to the surveillance microphones rather than each other following day 5. Then on day 9, one of the subjects begins to shriek loudly and run the length of the chamber. He does not stop for over 3 hours, and silence only comes after he physically rips his vocal cords. This outlandish display does not exhibit any kind of response by the other subjects within the chamber though, to the surprise of the observing scientists. Suddenly 2 more of the subjects begin to exude the same kind of shrieking behavior, while the other 2 begin to cover the observation portholes with paper smeared with feces. Then suddenly, the screaming stops, followed by multiple days of silence. The observers begin to check microphone equipment on an hourly basis to confirm the equipment is functional. When this began to stop being a viable observational option, they had to rely solely on the oxygen levels of the chamber itself. The levels indicated that they were still alive, and in fact seemed to be participating in some kind of strenuous activity. After having only this little bit of information to go on for multiple days, the researchers decided that they needed to break protocol of the experiment. So on the 14th day they announced over the loudspeakers that they'll be unsealing the chamber and commanding the subjects to lay down. Surprisingly, once they made this announcement, a single voice uttered a single phrase into the microphone:
"We no longer want to be freed."
The researchers, surprised by this, tried to interact more with the subjects inside the chamber and wait again to call off the experiment. Even with their effort, they're just greeted with more deafening silence. This prompts debate again, and the decision is made to open the chamber indefinitely this time. When the process of pumping the stimulant from the chamber is started, 3 voices begin to beg for them to stop. They beg for the gas to be pumped back in as if they did not just want it, but they needed it. The chamber is opened anyway, and soldiers are sent in to apprehend the subjects for analysis. They discovered that one of the subjects was dead and mutilated. To the horror of the researchers and the soldiers, the wounds looked to be self-inflicted. There also looked to be signs of cannibalism, and the fact that only 5 days of rations were used was also noted. The 4 surviving subjects had their lower abdominal organs hanging out of their tummies. It was observed that they had human flesh in their digestive tracts. When the subjects were to be moved, they began to fight and beg for the stimulant yet again. During the struggle, one of the soldiers is killed, another is mortally wounded, and 5 more are referenced to commit suicide in the following weeks after this ordeal. While being moved, one of the subjects is also mortally wounded as they bleed out and die after the subject exudes outlandish amounts of strength and resilience. It is referenced that multiple muscles and bones were damaged to the strength being exuded by the man. The 3 surviving subjects are put into heavy restraints and moved to the medical facility to try to save them. The first subject to have surgery attempted upon them is not affected by regular sedatives, but then is put under using an anesthetic gas. As soon as the subject falls asleep, he dies. Noting that when the subject went to sleep, the brainwaves of the subject stopped and they died, the researchers attempted the surgery on the next subject. This time the surgery was successful as they kept him awake. The subject seemed to be exuding strange behavior though, as he was seen to be smiling during the surgery. This is where things get a little strange. I have reread the story multiple times trying to make sure this wasn't just a comprehension error, but I am positive that this is where there is a continuity issue within the story. When the chamber is open, there are 4 subjects that are alive. As they go to remove the subjects, one of them dies and bleeds out, meaning that only 3 are surviving at this point. They attempt surgery on the first subject, put him under, and the subject dies. So there should be only 2 survivors at this point. The story continues to say that the surgery was successful on the other 2 subjects afterward, stating that there are 3 subjects at this point, which means that for some reason, even though the verbiage says that one of the subjects dies, something must have changed. Moving on though, the idea is then thrown around that the subject should be put back into the chamber, since them falling asleep plays a direct role with them living and dying. While this is being deliberated upon, another subject falls asleep and dies, so we are now down to 2 subjects. This prompts the decision for them to be moved back into the chamber, as the other subject that could speak was slipping out of consciousness also. They move the subjects into the chamber, and due to the fleeting brainwaves of the subject, they seal the chamber with the 3 researchers inside by the orders of the commander. Somehow one of the researchers has a pistol and immediately pulls it out and shoots this commander. Yet again, this detail stands out, as the commander is not sealed inside with the subjects. It even says 3 researchers and does not reference the commander at all, and also says one of the named 3, inferring that the commander is not one of those men. So how would the commander be able to be shot? Moving on, then the researcher shoots the mute subject and turns to take aim at the final survivor. He questions the subject and asks him what he is. The subject answers back, saying that
he is what is hidden deep within all of us, the id, the animalistic nature, the need for violence and rage.
Then the researcher shoots the subject and the story ends. This story was great at building up anticipation, and though there is not a huge climactic event that turns the story around, the ending is a great payoff. Though this does not mean there is not any hitches along the way. As I stated before, there's some consistency issues when you read the story. There is issues with just how many survivors there are, and if certain events happen or not. It stuck out to me, and I actually went back and reread the same group of paragraphs over and over again to try to make sure I did not make a mistake for myself. I even went to the point of checking on Creepypasta.com and the Wikia to make sure that it wasn't an error on that certain version. There was also the event with the killing of the commander, and just how that was able to happen. The way that the story is written, certain events do not come off clearly, and this makes for issues with comprehension, or with, in my case, what I think to be inconsistencies with the actual story itself. But with all that being said, the rating that I would give the Rushing Sleep Experiment is good. When I came into this story, I fully expected to give it a must-read rating. I even considered it while I was reading the beginning of this creepypasta for this analysis. But the hitches that I highlighted above were too much to look past. I had to dock it due to me having to go back and reread chapters, not because of hidden details, but because details are not matching up to the rest of the story, or were unable to be discerned from the writing. This is where I also quickly address the possibility of the story being true. You will see people online trying to say that this is a true story. This is just not the case. The Soviet Union was notorious for not pulling any punches when trying to get things done and making themselves above other countries. But there is no information in any history books, files, or any other informational documents referencing something like this. Or at least there hasn't been any information declassified of something like this happening yet. I guess we would never know though. So I think this major story in the creepypasta community is worth reading, and next time I'll be looking at another one that is painted in the same light. Or would you call that a window to the soul? See you then.